Subcommittees will come to order. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. At this time, I will recognize myself for an opening statement. If someone would grab the back door, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. The State of Israel has always been surrounded by threats since its existence. Threats by nations and terror groups that hate Israel because it is a Jewish state. The goal of these haters has been to eliminate the State of Israel, and aggression started as soon as Israel became an established state. Arab armies amassed on its borders to destroy it, but yet Israel has continued to exist in the face of suicide bombers and terrorist onslaughts like no country in history. Most recently, 16 people in a bus were wounded yesterday in a bus bombing in Jerusalem, reminiscent of the wave of Palestinian suicide bombings that claimed so many lives a decade ago. In recent years, the threats to Israel have increased and become even more dangerous. The volatile situation in Syria and its transformation into a full-blown terrorist haven directly threatens Israel's security. Al-Qaeda's Syrian affiliate, the Nusra Front, has at times literally straddled the Syrian-Israeli border. ISIS, which is even more brutal than Al-Qaeda, controls large parts of Syria. Lebanese Hezbollah is heavily involved in the fighting in Syria, securing its valuable arms transfer corridor from its sponsors of no other than Iran. Iran has transferred game-changing weapon systems into Lebanon to arm this terrorist proxy, including anti-ship cruise missiles and air defense systems and precision-guided surface-to-surface missiles. Hezbollah already has an estimated 150,000 rockets and missiles in its stockpile. That's enough to rain down 1,500 rockets a day in Israel for over 2 months. All of these weapon systems are aimed for Israel. Hezbollah is amassing valuable tactical experience in Syria. It's mastering the use of diverse weapon systems and working in coordination with Iran and the Russians. Meanwhile, there is Gaza. Israeli officials now believe that Hamas has completely replenished its rocket supply that Israel destroyed in 2014. Hamas is building a sophisticated network of tunnels under the Gaza Strip for the purpose of securing arms supply lines and using those tunnels to strike at Israel. Yesterday, Israeli officials announced the discovery of a Hamas tunnel running from Gaza into the Israeli territory, fully equipped with electricity, communication lines, and a rail line. All of these actions by all of these groups and states are aggression against Israel. Israel tries to defend its sovereignty the best it can. There's also a new kind of terrorism. Since September, Palestinian lone wolf terrorists have carried out hundreds of attacks against civilians in Israel. These terrorists will do anything to kill, stab, ram their vehicles into civilians, and they just shoot indiscriminately. They are fueled directly by the hateful incitement of the Palestinian Authority. Palestinian Authority President Abbas proclaimed, quote, "We welcome every drop of blood spilled in Jerusalem. This is pure blood, blood on its way to Allah." This latest wave of attacks has killed 34 people, injured over 400. Among those killed were 2 Americans, one of which is from my state of Texas, Taylor Force. He was an Eagle Scout, a West Point grad, and he served in Afghanistan and Iraq. Aside from terrorism, Israel also faces a threat that also seeks its ultimate destruction. In recent years, the global boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement has led to an onslaught of campaigns targeting Israel. This movement obviously doesn't like the settlements in the West Bank. Settlements in the West Bank, in my opinion, are an internal matter for Israel, and it's nobody else's business what a state decides on where people live and don't live. Out-of-towners, including the BDS and our own State Department, need to stay out of where people live in Israel. We certainly wouldn't like someone telling us where people should settle in the United States. And then, of course, we have the nuclear Iran deal. The deal makes it only a matter of time before the mullahs in Tehran develop a nuclear weapon. Given their anti-Semitic rhetoric, we all know that they intend to do with that bomb. The $100 billion signing bonus and the financial boon expected with sanctions relief raised serious concern about the world's #1 state sponsor of terrorism. That's Iran. They will funnel more and more cash to their terrorist groups all over the world. Reports since the deal went into effect indicate that both Iran significantly has increased its financial support for both terrorist groups, Hezbollah and Hamas. In February, Iran announced that it would give $7,000 to families of Palestinians who kill Israelis, an additional $30,000 to every family whose home Israel demolished due to the family's involvement in terrorism. Since the nuclear deal was struck, Iran has launched 3 ballistic missile tests. The most recent one launched missiles marked with the words, "Israel must be wiped off the map." The deal will lift the international ban on Iran's ballistic missiles in 8 years. It's no wonder why Israeli leaders call the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action a bad deal for Israel's survival. Despite these threats, our relationship with Israel has become strained under current administration policies. We must do more to repair this important relationship and protect our friends and allies. We must make it clear that all of these actions against Israel are because it is a Jewish state. Israel and the United States share common values. We must recognize that the threats that confront Israel really affect the United States as well. The same terrorist group that wants to destroy Israel first wants to destroy the United States. The United States must show that it is partner with Israel in its self-defense, and Israel, in the meantime, better keep its powder dry, and that's just the way it is. I'll recognize the ranking member on the Terrorism Subcommittee, Mr. Keating from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Chairman Poe, and thank you for conducting this hearing. I'd also like to welcome and thank Chair Ros-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, and members of the Middle East and North Africa Subcommittee for joining us today. Welcome. Lastly, I'd like to thank our panel for being here to discuss the various threats to Israel. You're all experts in your field, and I look forward to hearing the nuances you bring to this vital topic. The United States and Israel have always had a special relationship. This relationship is unlike any other, and it's founded on common values and shared interests. And certainly, all of us keep the people that were injured just recently in the bus bombing in our thoughts and prayers for their full recovery. Our country has defended Israel's right to exist since the very beginning, a stance we have demonstrated through will and force. Historically, Israel is the top recipient of U.S. military aid, and administration after administration has worked to ensure that Israel maintains its qualitative military edge. We've witnessed continued funding for the Iron Dome defense system. We've doubled the stockpiles of emergency military equipment for Israel. And first, we've approved the sale of bunker-busting bombs to Israel as well. Additionally, we're in the process of creating a new memorandum of understanding which could ultimately increase the security assistance already provided to Israel. This support's designed to deter and to mitigate threats to one of our closest allies. And as I'm confident my colleagues agree, it's the role of the United States as a global leader, an active member of the United Nations, and as a friend of Israel to promote and encourage regional stability in the Middle East. Like many other countries in the region, Israel faces a number of challenges to its security, both internally and externally. Externally, the Islamic State is active in both the country's northern and southern boundaries, and Israel continues to face a constant threat from Hezbollah. Internally, violence between Israelis and Palestinians highlights the systemic distrust between the two groups. The prospects for renewed peace talks an effective broker in assisting Israel in its security needs, as well as promoting our own foreign policy goals in the region. This includes, at times, carefully examining Israel's actions to ensure they remain in line and consistent with our own American values and interests. As I said at the beginning, there are nuances to these topics and areas that need to be objectively examined. I hope we can hear today about the various challenges Israel faces, not just from terrorist organizations, but also economic pressures through the BDS movement. But most importantly, I'd like to hear how the U.S. and Israel can cooperate to solve these challenges. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman from Massachusetts. The Chair recognizes the Chairman of the Middle East and North Africa Subcommittee, Ms. Ileana Ros-Lehtinen from Florida.
Thank you so much, Judge Poe, and I'm so glad that both of our subcommittees have called this hearing jointly to discuss the many threats that Israel faces. Unfortunately, as both of our speakers have pointed out, this hearing is quite timely. Israel fell victim to a disgusting terror attack as 21 people were injured in a bus bombing in Jerusalem just yesterday. Our thoughts and prayers are with the victims, their families, and the people of Israel as they continue to seek peace and security. These so-called lone wolf attacks and knife-wielding individuals are said to be more difficult to protect against because there's no real organization or planning for it, just folks who are being incited to conduct these types of vicious attacks. It's the message they receive from the Palestinian leadership and Abu Mazen, and this is where the U.S. can do more. We can have more of an impact because Israel clearly knows how to best protect her citizens, but the Obama administration should be using the leverage we have over the Palestinian Authority to press it to stop the incitement and work with Israel to promote peace. However, the terrorist threats Israel faces aren't just limited to these bus bombings or knife attacks. I convened a hearing of our subcommittee last month on the growing threat that Hezbollah presents for Israel. And thanks to the Iran nuclear deal the Obama administration negotiated, Hezbollah stands to get even more financial and material support from Tehran. Even as Hezbollah fights in Syria, Iran has been transferring advanced weapons and weapon systems to its proxies through Syria and to Lebanon. Estimates now place Hezbollah's missile and rocket stockpiles in the area of 150,000. That's more than 10 times the amount when it indiscriminately rained down over 100 rockets a day for 32 days at northern Israel in the year 2006. And this number now includes more sophisticated missiles with guidance systems, putting Israel at even greater risk. Hamas remains a constant threat. And in fact, as Judge Poe mentioned, Israel recently just discovered the first Hamas tunnel from Gaza that reaches into Israel since the 2014 fighting. And while Egypt may help destroy some of Hamas's tunnels, much more assistance is needed in the fight in the Sinai against terror groups there, including ISIS and al-Qaeda affiliates. These terror groups are near Israel's borders in the Golan Heights and in Syria and in Sinai, and are trying to gain more influence within the Palestinian territories as well. If Iran is the #1 threat facing Israel, threat 1A is Hezbollah, Hamas, and all of the terror groups just on its borders. Then threat 1B has to be the ongoing efforts by Abu Mazen and the Palestinian leadership to delegitimize and isolate Israel on the international stage, at the UN, and other similar efforts like the Boycott, Divest, and Sanctions BDS movement. It is no secret that Abu Mazen has been pushing his scheme for unilateral statehood at the UN, trying to circumvent the peace process and a direct negotiated settlement with the Israelis. This effort saw UNESCO admit the non-existent state of Palestine to its membership, and then shortly after saw the UN upgrade the Palestinian status to non-member observer status. Of course, we all know that UNESCO, the UN Human Rights Council, and the UN in general have an anti-Israel agenda. Just in the past few weeks, we saw the Human Rights Council vote to establish a blacklist of companies that could be used by those seeking to participate in BDS, and which gives the impression that the UN supports BDS. UNESCO once again moved to remove any Jewish historical ties to Jerusalem, and we know that the Palestinians are working to reintroduce resolutions at the UN Security Council that would impose a two-state solution on Israel, along with artificial timelines for negotiations. I've asked the administration on several occasions to clarify its position on Israel at the UN Security Council, but we never get a straight answer, Mr. Chairman. It should be simple. It's been a longstanding U.S. policy to veto any such resolution, as we have in the past and as the Palestinians are seeking support for now, yet the administration will not reaffirm that policy. This is worrisome, and we should continue to press the administration to do more to stand by Israel and make it clear in no uncertain terms that we will veto any resolution that imposes a solution upon Israel. We need to also take a closer look at all of those behind the BDS movement and work to counter these efforts. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for this joint hearing.
Thank the gentlelady. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Deutsch, for his opening statement, the ranking member of the subcommittee.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman Poe and Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, for holding today's hearing. And thank you to my fellow Ranking Member Keating. And thanks all of you for your strong support of the U.S.-Israel relationship. I'd like to echo the sentiments of my colleagues in expressing my deep sympathy for the individuals injured in the bus bombing on Monday and to their families. This atrocious attack is unacceptable and unfortunately is emblematic of the constant threats that Israel faces. The hearing today gives us the opportunity to assess the varied dangers facing Israel. To fully understand these threats and their effects on the U.S.-Israel relationship, we have to take a serious look at all of the challenges Israel faces on a daily basis, both strategic and political. Our two governments are currently in negotiations over a new 10-year memorandum of understanding that will serve as the basis of our assistance relationship. The United States has never wavered on its commitment to ensuring Israel is able to defend herself against any and all threats, and a new MOU must reflect the current and future security threats to Israel from both state and non-state actors. At any given time, Israel faces the threat of rocket attacks from every single corner of her territory, from Hezbollah missiles shot from Lebanon, Syria to the north, Hamas rockets from the south, ISIS-affiliated militants in Sinai. Hezbollah, a terrorist organization founded on the premise of resistance to the Zionist regime and bankrolled by Iran, now has an arsenal of over 150,000 rockets, many with advanced capabilities. Hezbollah's 6,000 to 8,000 mercenaries are fighting in the Syrian conflict and have given it access to even more advanced weaponry. Weapons flowing from Iran to Hezbollah via Syria are being placed in precarious locations close to Israel's border, in the Golan Heights, for example. And last week, Prime Minister Netanyahu publicly acknowledged that Israel has had to strike down dozens of these convoys in order to prevent Hezbollah from stockpiling what he referred to as game-changing weapons on Israel's borders. Operating out of Gaza, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, two more of Iran's beneficiaries, have carried out decades of violent attacks on Israeli civilians. During the 50 days of Operation Protective Edge in 2014, 4,564 rockets and mortars were fired at Israel from Gaza. But thanks to the robust cooperative missile defense programs between the United States and Israel, Iron Dome was able to intercept over 700 rockets that would have landed in populated areas. Since September of 2015, Israel has faced a new wave of violence, this time in the form of what have been dubbed lone wolf attacks. These deadly stabbings, shootings, and car rammings aren't coming from known terrorists or those affiliated with terror cells. Instead, these attackers are using kitchen knives, axes, and their vehicles to target random Israeli citizens. These lone wolf attacks have taken the lives of over 30 people, including American students Ezra Schwartz and Taylor Force. These attacks are the result of, among others, the violent incitement within Palestinian society. And I was proud to join Chairman Ros-Lehtinen in authoring a resolution that passed the House unanimously last fall, condemning incitement within the Palestinian Authority. The entire world must condemn these indiscriminate attacks. Of course, Iran continues to pose an existential threat to Israel despite concluding the nuclear agreement. In an outrageous display of defiance, Iran recently test-fired a ballistic missile emblazoned with the phrase, "Israel must be wiped off the earth," in Hebrew. Many of us, both supporters and opponents of the nuclear deal, are deeply committed to ensuring that the funds gained from sanctions relief do not go towards supporting terrorism aimed at Israel or others in the region. This includes funding and exporting weapons to terrorist organizations. It includes the continued development of ballistic missiles capable of delivering a nuclear warhead, and it includes attempts to stir up trouble in other countries in the Middle East in an attempt to provoke instability across the region. And there is nothing in the Iran nuclear deal, there is nothing in the deal that prevents additional sanctions from being imposed against Iran for those areas outside of the nuclear deal, including their support for terrorism, nor is there anything in the nuclear deal that prevents states like my own state of Florida from continuing to ensure that our state pension money and all those funds do not contribute to Iran's destabilizing activities in the region. And not all of the threats facing Israel are security related. In the past year, the supporters of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, the economic warfare against Israel, disturbingly gained traction as they position themselves as a means of nonviolent resistance. In reality, what they're doing is unjustly singling out and demonizing one country, Israel. And I wish the voices of those who support BDS spoke out against the dozens of tyrannical regimes who violate the human rights of their people every day. And while it's perfectly acceptable for people to criticize government policies, it is unacceptable when that criticism is intended to attack the legitimacy and the very existence of a nation. And that's what the BDS movement does. Unfortunately, those hurt most by BDS efforts often are Palestinian workers whose jobs are put at risk by those who seek to boycott Israel. We have to work toward the goal of a two-state solution, two states living side by side in peace and security with thriving economies. And the BDS movement only pushes the prospects of peace further out of reach by unjustly placing blame on one side instead of urging both sides to the negotiating table. And finally, Mr. Chairman, while efforts to, and Madam Chairman, while efforts to delegitimize Israel in the international community are nothing new, Israel and our allies must continue to meet them with resolve. The United Nations Human Rights Council continues to debate and pass anti-Israel resolutions at every one of its meetings, while ignoring Syria, Iran, and the rest of the world's human rights abusers. These efforts must be condemned, and further, any effort that seeks to circumvent direct negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians must be opposed. The only path to two states for two peoples is through direct negotiations between the two parties. This should be encouraged by anyone who considers themselves to be a friend of Israel and by anyone who claims to want what's best for the Palestinian people. We have to recognize the U.S. and Israel stand together not just because we share security concerns, but because we share the same values of democracy, equality, and freedom. And I look forward to discussing the ways in which we can keep Israel vibrant and strong, protect the security of our ally, and foster an environment that is conducive to peace. I appreciate the time, Mr. Chairman.
Appreciate the comments by the gentleman from Florida. Chair will now recognize other members for a 1-minute opening statement if they wish. I'm going to ask the members to keep it to 1 minute or less so we can get our witnesses, have them testify, and try to do all of this before we have to break for votes. Chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman Ted Poe and Chairwoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, for holding this important joint hearing with distinguished witnesses. As our closest ally in the Middle East, Israel faces some of the greatest threats in its history. Most critically, the bizarre Iran nuclear deal has provided the Iranian regime over $100 billion, enabling them to further promote terrorism, which enhances threats to Israel. Even more dangerously, the deal provides for Iranian regime to provide a path forward to producing nuclear weapons. This fact, combined with Iran's testing of 2 ballistic missiles in March, reveal a clear picture of damage the President's short-sighted deal could potentially have on American families. To make matters worse, these 2 ballistic missiles included the phrase, "Israel must be wiped off the map," written in Hebrew as a blatant threat. Aside from the threat of Iran, Israel has suffered from an increase in lone wolf terrorist attacks. According to Israeli intelligence, there have been more than 230 attacks in the last 7 months, killing 34 persons, injuring 400. I look forward to the bipartisan cooperation that we have already heard today, working with our colleagues. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley. The chair recognizes Mr. Conley if he wants to give an opening statement. From Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I echo the concerns of my colleagues about the security of Israel and the lack of balance at international institutions, including the United Nations, when examining human rights violations and policies that subjugate whole parts of a population. I also think, candidly, that a threat to Israel is also internal. And we ought to be examining that as well as a friend to Israel. The concern, the long-term concern of the consequences of and endless occupation of the West Bank, and the demographic imperative of the growth of both an Arab and Palestinian population. These are of concerns to deep friends of Israel, and certainly if, we heard some of those echoed by the Vice President of the United States last night. In any event, I'm glad we're having a hearing, and I hope we look at both. And I want to certainly associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Deutsch. At the end of the day, there can be no substitute for the two parties sitting down and having direct talks if we're ever going to have peace in this quarter of the world. I thank the Chair.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. DeSantis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for having this hearing. I support Prime Minister Netanyahu's declaration that the Golan Heights should not be given back to Syria. I think that would attract terrorists. They'd be launching attacks against the Jewish state incessantly. We've seen the Iran deal has really hastened Iran's ascent as the dominant Islamist power in the region. They're firing missiles. They're exporting terrorism. They have a major cash influx. We're told that Israel needs to make all these concessions for peace with the Palestinians, but the Palestinians still don't recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state and still incite terrorism and hatred against the Jewish people. Our friends in Europe sometimes don't fare much better. Many of those countries are moving in the direction of boycotting Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, and they hold no other country to that same standard. So I appreciate you holding this hearing. I think we have to take these threats to Israel seriously, and I look forward to a new administration coming in and finally moving our embassy to Jerusalem where it belongs. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline, for his 1-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Poe and Chairman Ros-Lehtinen and Ranking Members Keating and Deutsch for calling this hearing on the threats to the Jewish state. With the rise of violence within Israel and the growing instability in the region at large, this hearing is very timely. I'd also like to thank our witnesses for being here today. Like others, I'd like to express my horror and outrage at yesterday's terrorist attack in Jerusalem that targeted innocent men, women, and children. My thoughts and prayers are with the victims of this horrific attack and their families. It's completely unacceptable that the Israeli people continue to live under the constant threat of terrorist violence. I know my colleagues join me in strong support of the people of Israel today. We will do everything we can to help bring those responsible to justice and provide whatever assistance is necessary to combat the threat of terrorism. Israel, like every nation, has the right to protect its people against cowardly terrorist attacks. The fact that this violence has escalated over the past 2 years is especially troubling, and the fact that the Palestinian Authority has not taken a forceful stance against this terrorism threatens the long-term stability of both the Israelis and the Palestinians and threatens peace negotiations going forward. Both sides must do all they can to foster an environment for seeking peace, and the United States must continue to be there to encourage both sides to seek peace and to ensure Israel's security. This hearing will help us better understand all of the threats facing Israel and the rapidly changing and dangerous context of these threats. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Trott for his opening statement.
I'd like to thank the respective committee chairs and ranking members for holding this important hearing. As has been mentioned several times already, Israel is under constant threat from Iran and their proxies, a threat that's intensified under the administration's repeated acquiescence. I was an early and often outspoken critic of the nuclear deal with Iran, and if you look at their behavior over the past 6 months, it's pretty clear that my comments were correct, and I continue to maintain you can't do a good deal with a bad guy. Most recently, it was rumored that the administration was looking to do an end around Congress and give Iran access to the U.S. dollar, yet another concession. In an effort to stop this misguided policy, I recently introduced legislation that would block the Department of Treasury from providing Iran access to the U.S. dollar. If the administration is not willing to stand with Israel, then it's even more important to show the world that the House of Representatives will. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Now that we've all had our say, you will get your say, but not so quick. We are now in the middle of votes. We will return after votes, and then we will hear from our witnesses. Thank you for your patience. So the committees stand adjourned until 10 minutes after votes are concluded. The subcommittees will come to order. Without objection, all of the witnesses' prepared statements will be made part of the record. I ask that each witness keep your presentation to no more than 5 minutes. When the red light comes on, that means stop talking. I'll introduce each witness and then give them time for opening statements. Dr. Michael Rubin is currently a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on terrorism. He formerly served as a Pentagon official whose major research areas were the Middle East, Turkey, Iran, and diplomacy. Dr. Jonathan Snasner is the vice president and researcher at the Foundation of the Defense for Democracies, where he focuses on Palestinian politics, Iran, and Israeli affairs. He previously served as terrorism finance analyst at the U.S. Department of Treasury. Mr. David McCloskey is the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow with the Irvin Levy Foundation Program on the U.S.-Israel Strategic Relationship at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He recently served as a senior advisor on Secretary Kerry's Middle East Peace Team. And Dr. Tamara Kaufman-Witz is the director of the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institute. She previously served as Deputy Assistant Director or Secretary of the State for the Near Eastern Affairs, coordinating U.S. policy on democracy and human rights in the Middle East. Dr. Rubin, we'll start with you.
Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, distinguished representatives, it's an honor to speak before you today about the growing threats Israel faces to its security. I've detailed in my written testimony how Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps will benefit disproportionately from Iran's reintegration into the world economy. Because the IRGC cares far less about bolstering the prosperity of the Iranian citizenry versus resourcing its ideological desire to undermine, delegitimize, and attack Israel, Israel faces enhanced enemy capabilities on almost all fronts. I do not want to repeat the threats described by my fellow panelists in their written testimony. All these are relevant and true. Rather, I would like to draw attention to two looming problems that are not receiving adequate attention. In recent years, Iran has developed a number of different surveillance and attack drones. While its claims to have reverse-engineered a downed CIA drone are risible, U.S. military pilots flying over the Persian Gulf regularly describe seeing Iranian UAVs. Iran has openly deployed its indigenous UAV technology into Syria and Iraq, and perhaps Lebanon as well. Iranian UAVs fly over Syria's largest city in Aleppo, and so could just as easily fly over the Golan Heights, the Galilee, or into international air paths over Tel Aviv's Ben Gurion International Airport or Israel's smaller regional airports. That Iranian sources openly brag about their development of both suicide drones and new satellite-guided drone navigation capabilities augments concern. Neither Iran nor its proxies need to be able to strike an aircraft or an airport to be successful. Simply interfering with civilian air traffic will likely augment Israel's isolation as airlines suspend service into Tel Aviv. Nor is the UAV threat the only one looming for Israel. With the discovery of gas fields in the eastern Mediterranean, Lebanese authorities have asserted a claim to 300 square miles of Israeli waters. Therefore, even though the United Nations formally certified Israel's withdrawal from Lebanon complete, the dispute over Sheba Farms notwithstanding, Lebanon has resurrected a new claim that provides Hezbollah cover to pursue its rearmament and terrorism. Indeed, Hezbollah has bragged that it has been training operatives in underwater sabotage. This not only suggests a new terror capability that could be utilized against Israel, but is also a direct threat to many American engineers and oil workers involved in the region. As we consider the threats not only to Israel but the United States and our moderate Arab allies as well, it is essential to consider not only the enhancement of terrorist and missile threats Israel has long faced, but also the new platforms which will be used to attack the Jewish state. Since Israel's enemies make no secret of their desire also to target and defeat the United States, it is time to begin a serious discussion about how to reformulate Israel's qualitative military edge for the next generation. I also want to just add one separate point with regard to the demographic imperative and the demographic challenges which Israel faced. We should not be distracted by notions of the demographic imperative as oftentimes we are now. The Palestinian Statistics Agency statistics cannot be taken at face value. They double count Jerusalem, they refuse to count emigration. And if you compare multiple censes, you notice that the predictions are off by several percentage points and are frankly readjusted with magic numbers. Bad data, even if diplomatically convenient, oftentimes leads to bad policy. And with that, I conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rubin. Mr. Shannonser.
Mr. Chairman, Madam Chairman, on behalf of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, thank you for inviting me to testify. I was asked today to talk about the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement, also known as BDS. This campaign claims to pursue justice for the Palestinians. In truth, many of these groups seek to wage an economic war against Israel. Members of the committee, I worked as a terrorism finance analyst at the U.S. Treasury from 2004 to 2007. My job was to help freeze the assets of terrorist financiers. I'm out of government now, but I continue to monitor trends in the field. FDD recently completed research that tracked employees from organizations implicated by the federal government for terrorism finance. Our research yielded a troubling outcome in the case of 3 U.S.-based organizations involving the financing of Hamas, a designated terrorist group with a grisly track record of suicide bombings and firing rockets at civilian population, and whose charter openly calls for the annihilation of Israel. The 3 now defunct organizations are Holy Land Foundation for Relief and Development, Kind Hearts for Charitable Humanitarian Development, and the Islamic Association for Palestine. As it turns out, many individuals who previously worked for or on behalf of these groups now work or fundraise for an Illinois-based organization called American Muslims for Palestine, otherwise known as AMP. AMP is arguably the leading BDS organization in the U.S. It is a key sponsor of the anti-Israel campus network known as Students for Justice in Palestine, or SJP. AMP provides money, speakers, training, printed materials, and so-called apartheid walls to SJP activists. AMP even has a campus coordinator who orchestrates the BDS activities of SJP and other campus groups nationwide. The overlap between AMP, Holy Land, Kind Hearts, and the Islamic Association for Palestine is striking. For example, Salah Sarsour, a former fundraiser for the Holy Land Foundation, is now an AMP board member, and he has twice served as AMP's National Conference chairman. There is also Jamal Sayed, who is director of the Mosque Foundation, which prosecutors identified as the key funder for the Holy Land Foundation. And as a reminder, a federal court found that Holy Land sent $12 million to Hamas over 10 years. Today, the Mosque Foundation donates to AMP, and Mr. Sayed has been a keynote speaker at AMP's annual fundraising dinner for 3 years running. Then there's Abdel Basset Hamayel, who is officially the registered agent for AMP. He is occasionally identified as AMP's director. Several sources point to Hamayel as the Wisconsin and Illinois representative for Kind Hearts, a group the Treasury called the progeny of the Holy Land Foundation. Treasury blocked the assets of Kind Hearts, and it was ultimately dissolved. Hamayel, I should note, was also the Secretary General of the Islamic Association for Palestine, or IAP, a group found civilly liable in a federal court for financing Hamas. And there are many other IAP-AMP connections. For example, the former president of IAP, Rafiq Jaber, is one prominent AMP figure. He has also been listed as the tax preparer for AMP's 501c3 fiscal sponsor since 2010. I'm referring here to the Americans for Justice in Palestine Educational Foundation, also known as AJP. There's also Osama Abu Ershad, who ran IAP's newspaper. He is currently the National Coordinator and Policy Director for AMP. Mr. Abu Ershad also runs a pro-Hamas newspaper in Virginia. Incidentally, we discovered that a major donor to AMP's conferences, the Zakat Foundation, is run by Khalil Demir. Demir signed the IRS 990 forms for Benevolence International Foundation, which Treasury shut down for funding al-Qaeda. There's also an unregistered BDS group that works with AMP, whose leader was reportedly a fighter for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, also a designated terrorist group. There's more, and so please read my testimony for the full picture. I should note here that our open source research did not indicate that AMP or any of these individuals are currently involved in illegal activity. But I should also note that AMP, at their 2014 annual conference, held a panel inviting guests to, quote, come navigate the fine line between legal activism and material support for terrorism, end quote. It's also noteworthy that a recent photo from AMP's suburban Chicago headquarters features a poster with the phrase, quote, no Jew will live among them in Jerusalem, end quote. This sounds a lot like promoting Hamas's agenda here in the United States, if you ask me. In short, the BDS campaign may pose a threat to Israel, but the network I describe here is decidedly an American problem. There appear to be flaws in the federal and state oversight of nonprofits and charities. In my written testimony, I suggest ways to increase transparency. Let me conclude with this. BDS activists are free to say what they want, whether true or false. But tax-advantaged organizations are obliged to be transparent. Americans have a right to know who is leading the BDS campaign, and so do the students who may not be aware of AMP's leaders or their goals. Once again, thank you for inviting me to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Murkowski.
Mr. Chairman, Madam Chairwoman, ranking members, of course, thank you for the opportunity to speak before these two distinguished subcommittees. In keeping with the questions you asked us about challenges, I'd like to first focus on security in the evolving threat environment. Israel is largely encircled by non-state actors today. They have no problem to embed themselves in the heart of urban areas, fire rockets into Israeli cities, and in so doing challenge Israel to retaliate, which leads to greater Palestinian casualties. In Lebanon, the dominant non-state actor is Hezbollah, which, as you have pointed out, is believed to have 150,000 rockets. Then there is Hamas in Gaza. While today there's relative quiet along this front, it's only a matter of time before a fourth war begins in Gaza. Needless to say, without U.S. military assistance writ large and without Iron Dome specifically, Israel's security predicament would be far worse. Of course, beyond the challenges of its immediate neighbors, there's also Iran and its regional proxies. Israel might not like the Iran deal, as we all know, but it understands and must now turn towards enhancing the U.S.-Israel bilateral security relationship, as should the United States as well. This rather sober assessment has been punctuated by relative success in the Israeli-Palestinian security cooperation in the West Bank. Of course, we don't know who did this attack yesterday on the bus. It has the markings of a homemade and not organizational type, which would be consistent. But I would say that Israeli officials say that the PA security cooperation with Israel has been essential in reducing this fact and reducing the recent wave of violence. Just last week, Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Ya'alon held a press conference, and he said, quote, "The PA has worked tirelessly recently to stop terror," end quote. In return, Israel's security services has served as an important stabilizing role within the Israeli structure and promoted further economic and security cooperation with the Palestinians. However, it may still be too soon to pronounce that the wave of stabbings is over, as there could be an upsurge with the upcoming holiday season, which begins in the next few days. So what can the U.S. do to tackle these threats and seize the opportunities? When it comes to Iran, the U.S. and Israel need to strictly enforce Iranian compliance of the nuclear deal and push back against malign Iranian behavior in the region. The U.S. and Israel should form a joint committee which would deal with the implementation of JCPOA, address the potential violations, and maintain and strengthen non-nuclear sanctions. The U.S. and Israel should also swiftly conclude negotiations for a 10-year MOU. Israel's deterrent power, as you know, is in large part a reflection of how its adversaries view the strength of its strategic relationship with Washington. In a broad sense, Israel views the strength of the U.S.-Israel relationship as a function of how the U.S. is perceived in the region by friend and foe alike. If the U.S. is viewed as the center of the pragmatic camp in the Middle East, this will bolster the position of this critical bilateral relationship beyond all its other obvious benefits. On the Palestinian issue, there remain several challenges. The U.S. has engaged in 3 noble efforts in 2000, 2007, 2008, 2014 to solve the entire conflict. For a variety of reasons, these efforts didn't succeed. Under the current leadership, I don't see succeeding in the near future. I'm rather skeptical about efforts to put forward parameters at the UN Security Council, which would be interpreted by both sides as an imposed solution and could serve as a baseline for defiance rather than bringing the parties closer. Indeed, we need to find a way to maintain the viability of a two-state outcome, even if we can't implement a two-state solution today. I have some ideas which I can discuss when we have more time in the Q&A. There are also moves the Palestinians could take to prove their commitment to 2 states as well, including jettisoning its anti-normalization policy and stop incentivizing terror by paying money to Palestinian prisoners and relatives of suicide bombers. The U.S. needs to sensitize our European allies to these issues. Given the closeness between the Europeans and the Palestinians, it would carry weight if the Europeans practice the same tough love they have urged the United States to administer when it comes to Israel, but they don't seem to do it to our Palestinian friends. The issue of boycott and divestment sanctions, BDS, is important to me. I've made 121 campus visits, mostly to discuss this issue. And if the BDS movement isn't blunted and there's no movement on the ground towards peace, I fear that the movement could metastasize beyond college campuses. In conclusion, there are definite challenges, but there are also opportunities amid the crises. The dynamism of the U.S.-Israel relationship will be tested by how our two countries work together to meet these new challenges, and in so doing, take our relationship to the next level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Dr. Witz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Chairman, Mr. Keating and Mr. Deutsch, members of the committee. I appreciate the invitation to appear before you, and I must emphasize, as always, that I represent only myself before you because the Brookings Institution does not take any positions on policy issues. On the afternoon following a day Israelis began with the discovery of yet another Hamas tunnel from Gaza into Israel and that ended with the bombing of a bus, it seems like a very apt and sobering opportunity to give you some thoughts on the threats facing Israel from terrorism and from the impact of regional disorder. I've had the chance to discuss these concerns with a range of Israeli officials and experts in the last several months, and I'll share my impressions with you. Let me begin with Iran. When I appeared before you just about a year ago, I said that whether or not there was a nuclear deal, I thought we would see a more aggressive approach by Iran in a host of arenas around the region, where the upheaval has given them greater opportunities than before. And indeed, that's what we've seen. Iran, helped in Syria by Russia, has pushed forward assertively to advance its influence and strengthen its allies around the region. In my view, this escalation of Iran's attempts at subversion was inevitable with or without a nuclear agreement. Iran has never lacked motivation for its assertions of power. Iran's sanctions-induced economic hardship did not prevent the country from spending billions supporting Assad and Hezbollah. The fact is that the Arab uprisings of 2011, the civil wars that emerged in their wake, and the sectarian narratives employed by Iran and its Arab adversaries have all given the Islamic Republic unprecedented opportunity to expand its activities, and it's exploited these opportunities very successfully. The main driver of instability and threat in the Middle East today is the civil violence that we see in Syria, Yemen, Libya, and increasingly Iraq. Ending those civil wars and the opportunities they create for bad actors should be a top priority for the United States and others concerned with regional stability. The nuclear agreement with Iran is a concrete rollback of Iranian capability, and IDF Chief of Staff Gadi Eisenkot noted in January that it abates for a period of time what had been Israel's greatest and most urgent security threat. And this gives the IDF important breathing space in which to focus on building its capabilities to address other threats and opportunities. In Syria, the scenario that most concerns Israel is one in which Assad remains in power in Damascus and dependent on Iran for survival. Israeli officials also worry that continued chaos in Syria could allow jihadi groups like Jabhat al-Nusra or the Islamic State to launch attacks into Israel from the Golan. But Israel's greatest concern is the impact of the Syrian war on Hezbollah for three reasons. First, Hezbollah's investment in saving Assad has altered the political equation in Lebanon in ways that could destabilize that country and motivate Hezbollah to try and win political points domestically by attacking Israel. Second, the prospect of an outcome from the Syrian war that leaves Assad in power and Iran in effective control presages further transfers of weapons and technology from Iran to Hezbollah through Damascus. That's why the possibility of a negotiated settlement leaving Assad in power is such a concerning outcome for Israel. Third, the Syrian war has given Hezbollah fighters extensive experience in conventional warfare, increasing their battle hardiness and capabilities in the event of another conflict with Israel. A few comments on Hamas in Gaza. While Hamas has rebuilt, apparently, some of its tunnel and rocket capabilities since the 2014 conflict, current events suggest that it's still more interested right now in survival than in confrontation. But should Hamas provoke another round with Israel, there's no question that the IDF would face many of the same military challenges that it faced in 2014. Indeed, fighting terrorism in a heavily populated environment is a long-term challenge for the IDF, whether in Gaza or potentially southern Lebanon or even potentially the West Bank. So building up new tactics and new capabilities against this challenge is a key task for Israel's military. The situation in the West Bank is in many ways more volatile. My colleague has addressed it. What I will say is that the Palestinian Authority and Palestinian politics are not immune from the governance challenges faced by other Arab states. There's a wide and growing gap between the Palestinian leadership and the public, particularly young people who see little prospect for economic, diplomatic, or political progress in their current circumstances. This points to the fact that the stalemate in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict carries a continuing cost for both sides. The status quo is deteriorating, not static, and reminds us that a negotiated resolution of this conflict remains Israel's best option for long-term security. Finally, a word about ISIS in Sinai. The most recent statistics from the Tahrir Institute recorded 74 attacks against Egyptian targets in just the last quarter of 2015. That's nearly one every day. Egypt's counterterrorism campaign in Sinai has been of limited impact. One Israeli source told me that the Egyptian campaign was mostly good at making the sand jump. The Obama administration, as you know, is redirecting U.S. military assistance to Egypt away from long-term commitments to major weapon systems toward a focus on effective counterterror and border security. This is an effort that deserves the robust support of Congress. Changes in the region have shifted the nature of the threats facing Israel. And from a broader perspective, the decline, for now, of traditional state-based threats offers two opportunities for Israel. First, time and space to undertake longer-term planning for the structure, size, and capabilities of the IDF to meet the challenges ahead. And second, and perhaps more importantly, to seize the moment to determine what Israel wants in its future relationship with the Palestinians and push forward with steps to achieve a two-state solution that is in Israel's interests. As the U.S. and Israel continue their discussions on a new 10-year MOU, it's important to evaluate the shift in Israel's threat environment and help Israel prepare accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Witz. I'll recognize myself for questions. These entities have been mentioned by the four of y'all that are hostile toward Israel. Hezbollah, Hamas, Syria, Nusra Front, the Palestinians, ISIS, and Iran, including the three organizations that are defunct, the Holy Land Foundation, the Kind Hearts, interesting name, Islamic Association for Palestine. All of these groups do not like Israel. Some of them have publicly proclaimed death to the Israelis. But they have one thing in common: none of them like Israel. What is the basis of that? Why are they hating on Israel for so many years, if I can use a phrase my grandkids use? One of you want to try to address that? Dr. Rubin.
If I may, very briefly.
Please.
It's possible to think about terrorism and the motivations for terrorism on a spectrum ranging from grievance on one side to ideology on the other. Our State Department across administrations tends to be addicted to the notion that terrorism is motivated by grievance, and that can be very comforting because that means you can come up with some magic formula of incentives to make that terrorism go away. We need to recognize much more directly the ideological basis of most terrorism, that there is no magic formula, there is no concession, that ultimately what you have to do is delegitimize that ideology. We've done it before with the Baader-Meinhof gang. We can do it now.
Okay, let's be a little more specific. You got Iran testing ballistic missiles, and they put on the side in Hebrew, death to Jerusalem or death to Israel. Is this a religious phenomena, philosophy that is uniting these organizations, or is it not? What is the basis of the philosophy? Forget about the grievances. Center on the philosophy. What is the philosophy they all have in common, if they do have one in common?
Mr. Chairman, I think it's safe to say that we're talking about militant Islam, radical Islam, whatever you'd like to call it. I know it's not a very popular term these days in Washington, but it is a radical ideology that empowers both this, what we call the Sunni and Shia sides of the street. You've got the Islamic State, you've got the Islamic Republic. Their hatred for Israel, their Islamist ideology is what really motivates the terrorism that they carry out. This has been our battle since 9/11. We continue to battle it. It's taken on different forms in this town, but I think that the challenge still remains.
So if we recognize it as, for what it is, radical Islam opposed to Israel based on a philosophy, as opposed to a grievance, it's more difficult to deal with. Would you agree or not?
Absolutely.
All right, the IRGC, do you think that that should be labeled as a terrorist organization? Any of you think that it should?
Yes, I absolutely do. Now, in both Iran's constitution and in the founding statute of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, it defines the purpose of both the Islamic Republic and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as export of revolution. In 2008, in an internal Iranian debate, this was defined exclusively as hard power in terms of sabotaging other countries, basically with bombs and bullets. Now, we oftentimes talk about the Iranian political spectrum from hardliner to reformist. You will note that American policymakers don't talk about the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the factional divisions therein in the same way. Number one, because we don't have adequate intelligence on that. And number two, no matter what the Iranian people might think, it's ultimately the guys with the guns that matter, and the most ideologically pure members of these units are the ones that have the capabilities to attack Israel and the will to do so.
The groups, the Holy Land Foundation, the Kind Hearts, the Islamic Association for Palestine, those were tax-exempt organizations that are now defunct, and there's a new organization in Chicago, American Muslims for Palestine. Are some of the folks that were working with those groups that have been put out of business by the Treasury Department, have they moved over to this new organization to still doing the same thing?
Well, Mr. Chairman, we've identified in this testimony that we've got 3 individuals from Holy Land that have moved over to AMP.
Let me interrupt because I just got a few seconds left. Is this new organization, is it a tax-exempt organization as well?
Sure. So 3 from Holy Land, 3 from Islamic Association for Palestine, 1 from Kind Hearts, all now working for AMP, which is pretty significant, we think, when we look at the leadership. Are
they raising money for any terrorist organizations, or do you know?
Not that we know of. What we can tell you is that AMP is a corporate nonprofit. It has a 501c3 that is its fiscal sponsor, so it raises tax-deductible donations, passes them through what's known as AJP, Americans for Justice in Palestine. It passes through to AMP, and then AMP then passes it on to campus. It's quite a structure.
Thank you. I'll yield to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating, the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was intrigued with Dr. Whitta's comments about Egypt and advanced weaponry, but I want to take that on a different tack if I can. Last week, Prime Minister Netanyahu announced that Israel launched a number of strikes inside Syria targeting suspected arm transfers to Hezbollah fighters. When I talked to the Prime Minister last year, he said it's not surprising that he did that because he said unless something affects his borders, he had no intention of doing this. At the same time, Israel diplomatically reached out to Russia and wanted assurances that their weaponry, since they're departing the area with that announcement, not fall into the hands of Iranians or particularly Hezbollah. So there's a concern there. How much of a threat is that? Is the Russian weaponry falling into the hands of groups like Hezbollah? Mr. Makovsky.
Yeah. As far as I know, things like the SA-300, the SA-400 remain under Russian command and control. Russians have not been sharing this weaponry with the Syrian government or anything. They insist on operating it themselves. But I think what the Prime Minister, by the way, told you, I think is accurate. I think that is, Israel has learned from 1982 it's very difficult to social engineer an Arab state. And they are more humble about the limits of their use of force than others may be about them. And I think that they have limited their engagement in the Syria conflict to defense. You know, if you fire and hit Israel, Israel will hit back. But if they also see advanced weaponry, and Netanyahu has now said publicly, these have been dozens of times, that they've detected advanced weaponry going from Hezbollah in Lebanon, in Syria to Hezbollah in Lebanon, they're going to hit them. And but it's pure defense at this point, and I think they do not think they will be decisive in any way, shape, or form, given the myriad of militias inside Syria, and have taken, in that sense, a very low profile and very limited objectives.
He also mentioned, though, at the same time, I believe that it was Israel may enter the battlefield. Will those be instances where that weaponry is getting transferred? Is that your
As
guess?
far as I know, those have been, and I've asked this to IDF and other security people when I was over there, and they have a very limited kind of objective, which is advanced weaponry that's being transferred to Hezbollah in Lebanon.
I think that's a real concern to be watchful from the U.S. standpoint. You know, the lone wolf attacks, something that represent the greatest risk to us here in the U.S. as well. How much is that? Could you comment on how social media is being used in those areas, and what Israel might be doing to try and counter that, since it remains our greatest threat here at home as well?
I'll just throw in, maybe my colleagues have thoughts. I talked to the premier Palestinian pollster, Khalil Shakaki, maybe known to some of you, based in Ramallah. He told me 86% of Palestinian teenagers, probably no different than in this country, I should say, get their news from social media. I see this as a huge issue, which is Palestinian social media. We know a lot of 15-year-olds refer to their going on social media as it might be the final trigger for them in terms of doing their lone wolf attacks. Of course, there are deeper reasons, I'm sure, but I think it's very serious. I mean, it's striking to me that the startup nation of Israel that knows during the Gaza war, if someone's on a fourth floor walk up in Gaza, and Israel has this knock on the roof program, which is you're on a fourth floor walk up, but Israel is going to tell you you're about to hit this building, go a few blocks away. First of all, I don't know too many armies that would give such advance notice, but Israel does it. But if they could find the kid on the fourth floor walk up and send him a text message in Arabic during a war, there's got to be a way to use this startup nation to reach more conciliatory messages on in Arabic media. I think this is a real challenge, and I think you're very correct in putting your finger on, I think, a key venue of this issue of the effort against stabbings, which is need to work on the Arabic social media.
Yeah. Do you see anything with the BDS and the networking that surrounds that could be also something of a threat to Israel in terms of beyond just their divestiture attempts, but other means of expanding that being a threat for itself? I know in 16 states and localities there's already anti-BDS legislation, but how effective has it been to date in terms of hurting Israel, as well as do you see any way of collaboration with that effort and incorporating social media? I've left you 1 second. I'm sorry. Anything you could add?
Look, it should be said that BDS, and with all these campus resolutions, not a single American university has divested from Israel. So sometimes we need to remember that as well, that it has not yet happened. But it's a question of a certain mood that's set, an effort to try to compare Israel to an old South Africa, to invoke some of these old campus battles. And I think the only way to compete to this, I was just at Ohio State the night before a big BDS vote, meeting with Ohio State student senators. And my approach, and people on this panel know me, is that the only way to, the important thing is to do practical coexistence. And there are a lot of organizations out there that does people-to-people. I know there's an all-MEP group here in Washington and with an umbrella of like 90 different people-to-people groups. There's a need, students want to do practical coexistence. I think you need to look for ways that bring campuses, student groups together and do not rip the community apart over something that is divisive, counterproductive, and just wrong. And so I think we should be accentuating the positive rather than focusing, on the negative. You should warn against the negative, but you should focus on things that could be effective in building bridges of coexistence. There are a lot of groups out there that are doing that practical work, and I think students that go on alternative spring breaks and other sorts of activities to do this can do it in this Israeli-Palestinian sector as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank the gentleman for his questions. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, the chairman of the Middle East Subcommittee, for her comments, questions, and answers.
Thank you so much, Judge Poe. Last week, our Middle East Subcommittee had Assistant Secretary Patterson, and we asked her about the status of the MOU negotiations. She said this administration might not secure an agreement before the term is up, and we're seeing reports just today that the administration is about to approve sales of fighter jets to Qatar and Kuwait, which will, of course, worry the Israelis as this is set to erode its qualitative military edge. And continued U.S. assistance to Israel is so critical to ensuring that the Jewish state can protect herself against the threats that we're talking about today. And I'm sure that many of you would agree that this sends a troubling signal to Israel and to those who seek to do her harm. Those are the ones who really receive these signals. And for us to conclude the MOU and have a strong MOU, that would send a very strong message of support to Israel. So I hope that this administration does that, and maybe we'll talk about it if we have time. But Dr. Chancellor, I wanted to give you an opportunity to elaborate on the great research that you have done. You mentioned in your testimony that Treasury has not made a domestic designation of a charity for supporting terrorism since 2009. And we have all of these terror threats in our homeland, and I find that surprising. You're looking into the financial networks of some domestic entities that operate in support of the BDS campaign, and I thank you for that. What can you tell us about their donor networks and their corporate structure, and what does it say to you about no new designations? Do you think that Treasury has been successful in stopping illegal fundraising in the U.S., and that's why there have been no new designations, or would you say that there seems to be a shift in U.S. policy from this administration in recent years, and that makes it more difficult for our agencies to pursue domestic terrorism financing? And I'd like to give you the remaining time.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. On the question of Treasury designations, all I can tell you is anecdotally, when I speak to former Treasury colleagues, my understanding is that they don't look at these issues any longer. This may be something that is linked to this administration. It also could just be a shifting of the mission of Treasury. So I think I would be careful to say that this is politically motivated. My understanding is that the FBI should and is still looking at domestic terror finance. And so whenever we look at these illicit finance questions, I think there's probably a team of people who should be looking at it. But I think it might be an interesting question to ask the Treasury whether this is still their mission or not. As for the corporate structure of the groups that I talked about today, it's a very interesting structure in that there is a 501c3 which is transparent. That's the Americans for Justice in Palestine. They file 990s. They're the fiscal sponsor for this group AMP, which I described in detail today. AMP is a corporate nonprofit, which it's my understanding that this is supposed to be a temporary status for an organization on its way to being a full 501c3. They have not made that jump. And so I'm curious as to why they've not done so. And as I mentioned, AMP appears to be the organization that's giving a lot of the assistance to Students for Justice in Palestine, the campus-based groups. They're the ones who hand the apartheid walls, and they provide the speakers and printed material. They give a lot of guidance. They have a campus coordinator that works with SJP. So it's a very interesting corporate structure. I encourage you to take a look into that. And then as for the donor network, I can tell you that we have looked into it. I deliberately chose not to include it in our discussion today. As you know, the environment for Islamic charities has not been an easy one. I think there are a lot of Muslim Americans out there who are very scared of contributing to charities that may be involved in terrorism. I didn't want to list them. I'm happy to provide them to you offline. But the bottom line here from my perspective is that when you look at an organization like AMP, and they have individuals who have previously worked for charities that have either been designated by the U.S. government, that they have been dissolved by the U.S. government, or found civilly liable in a federal court, you would think that this would be something that they'd disclose to their donors. And I am not sure that they've done so. I think that that is a matter of significant concern.
That they're mandated to do, or should they be mandated to do?
It's my understanding that there is no watch list, so to speak, and I'm not suggesting that we have one, but I do think that disclosure of that past activity would be incredibly important to donors who are contributing to these charities, so that they know what they're getting into. They know that they could be running into problems later on down the line based on the past experiences of these individuals.
Thank you so much for such great research. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Deutsch from Florida.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Wittes, you spoke about, you referenced the attacks against Egypt in your testimony, and it's clear that Israel finds herself sharing many of the same security concerns as many of the Arab states in the neighborhood. Are there ways, the idea comes up from time to time, but are there tangible ways that these countries can work together to counter mutual threats, both Israel with those countries that where there are peace agreements in place, and perhaps even those countries where there are shared interests but not formal peace agreements?
Absolutely, Congressman Deutsch. I think that there are two key avenues, and we see some activity along both these lines already underway. The first is countering Iran and Iran's destabilizing activities around the region. This is the interest that has drawn Israel and a number of Arab states closer together over the past year than I think they have ever been before. And it's an interest that I think will be sustained into the future. It's not a short-term problem. So there is a lot of quiet conversation and information sharing. What there is not is kind of overt cooperation along these lines. But since a lot of this Iranian activity is below the radar, that kind of information sharing can be absolutely crucial. The second avenue is stabilizing key frontline states. And those include states that have peace treaties with Israel, most particularly Jordan, but Egypt as well. We know, of course, that the Gulf states have been important supporters financially and diplomatically and politically of both Jordan and Egypt, and that is absolutely crucial for both of those governments. I think Israel continues to keep an eye on Jordanian stability. And then, additionally, there is the question of diplomatic negotiations ending the civil war in Syria. Israel is not at the table. It's not in the room. But many of the Sunni Arab states are. And that's an additional opportunity for cooperation.
Thank you very much. Mr. Murkowski, I want to return to your topic of tough love. There are some who might suggest that the Vice President's expression of overwhelming frustration with Israel might constitute tough love from the United States. Do you agree? Secondly, if that's so, what is the kind of tough love that you would like to see by our European friends with respect to the Palestinians, and frankly, the kind of tough love that perhaps we should expect and administer here as well?
Thank you, Congressman. I want to be clear. By the way, on the last point about Ohio State, the BDS advocates lost the vote. So the anti-BDS forces won, if I didn't make that clear. When I spoke about about tough love, I was not talking as an advocate of it. I'm saying the same Europeans who call for tough love of the U.S. towards Israel are not willing to administer that when it comes to their own relationship with the Palestinians. That was the context of my remarks. For example, when the President of the United States delivered two speeches in May of 2011, where he talked about returning to the 67 borders plus swaps, land exchanges, there has not been an Obama speech equivalent out of Brussels or London or Berlin or Paris saying, and you Palestinians, when it comes to refugees, you return to the state of Palestine, not to Israel. That would be very important if the Europeans would do that. Or if they would say that, that the aid to families of suicide bombers is reprehensible. Or saying anti-normalization runs against the very spirit of peace. We want you to encourage more people-to-people exchanges. These are things the Europeans can do that would make a difference. And whatever is not said publicly, I am concerned, will not be heard on the Palestinian side. I think the Europeans could say it, but they've never been really prodded to do so.
Is there an opportunity to prod? I'd throw this out to Dr. Rubin, Dr. Shanzer. Is there an opportunity? Wouldn't it be appropriate to prod the Europeans to do exactly that now, even as we work under the Iran nuclear deal to make it easier for them to develop additional business in Iran? Not that they're linked, but given the successes that they're seeing under the nuclear deal, the ability to make further investment in Iran, and the way in which the nuclear deal encourages that, shouldn't we also be in a position to remind them that at the same time the threats that Iran poses in the region get in the way of peace, and also standing in the way of peace are the kinds of things that Mr. Murkowski just spoke about, and it would be helpful for them to say that clearly.
Congressman Deutsch, I think that we have some frank discussions that we need to be having with the Europeans right now. They're obviously very eager to reignite the financial relationships with Iranian businesses. First of all, and I think we've made this clear at FDD, that we are very concerned about the United States facilitating those through dollar transactions. We have said time and again that this is not a good idea to allow Iran access to our financial system in any way, despite the European request to do so, and we think that it should be, we should continue to hold the line on that. More broadly, I think the Europeans have not exactly played the role that we've looked for on the Iran deal or with regard to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The Europeans right now are mulling a resolution to pressure the Israelis through a multilateral decision-making process for how to solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I can't think of anything that would be more detrimental to Israel's long-term survivability than to have something akin to the P5+1 make a decision on how Israel should cede territory in the future to a state that is possibly not viable. So I think these are the sorts of discussions that we need to be having with the Europeans, both about Iran transactions as well as what they're doing at the UN. Neither have been terribly productive.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is it Shanzer, is that how you say that? Earlier in your comments, you said, I think we've been battling with radical Islam since 9/11. What do you think about the prior attacks, starting in '79, Yemen, the bombing of the Cole, the U.S. Marine barracks, and I can go in the prior, I mean, what about those?
You're absolutely right, Congressman Weber. I meant that we've been battling over it in this country, the debate over what to call it since 9/11. But in fact,
well, some of us haven't been.
Fair enough. But to your point, absolutely, we've been dealing with the radical Islam from the Islamic Republic since 1979,
okay.
Muslim Brotherhood since the 1920s.
I just want to make that point, and you could even go back further than that. But Mr. Murkowski, is that how you say that? You also said that Israel learned in your exchange with Bill Keating in 1982 that they can't socially engineer an Arab state. Would you explain that?
What I meant is, in 1982, Israel thought that it could decide who was going to be the next leader of Lebanon, a guy by the name of Bashar Jamal. And that whole experience ended in calamity. So I think they in terms of their interest, they are very keen in terms of where they could succeed and where they cannot succeed.
Okay, I'm sorry, I just wasn't familiar with that date, didn't know what you were referring to.
Yeah.
And then you also said Israel knocks on a roof in the social media battle, you indicated that if they could find that 12-year-old kid on the 4th floor, they should be able to. But I would offer that social media is a relatively new phenomenon, and at that level, Twitter and all that stuff, in the last, I don't know, 2 or 3 years, I'm dating myself, maybe longer than that. But some of these kids get indoctrinated to hate Jews since the time they're two or three or younger. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is accurate.
So how do you combat that?
Look, that's why you need the focus on the Palestinian incitement piece of this is important. I mentioned about this idea of removing, fighting against, once the United States law kicked in, I think in 2014, saying that the U.S. will not give money to entities that give money to relatives of suicide bombers, some of this money was moved offline through the PLO as opposed to the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, whose income is murky, but Abbas is the head of both. And so there needs to be sure that the signaling is that there's no money to suicide bombers. And we're promoting normalization between peoples. The signaling has got to come from the top. I agree with, I think it was Congressman Ros-Lehtinen on that there has to be clear signaling. Now, Abbas has gone on Israeli television in the last couple of weeks and said that he's against these knives, these stabbings, and it's true that the PA, and this was reported in Defense News, I happen to be sitting with a senior Israeli security official who says it's true, quoting the head of Palestinian intelligence saying that they have disrupted 200 attacks. They have confiscated knives from the school. They have plainclothesmen now at the border crossings, like Colombia and some of the other places to confiscate knives. So there's a multi-prong effort here that's needed. There's no silver bullet.
Right, I get that. I just want to make that point, then I want to move on. I think, back to you, Dr. Shanzer, you also said that the Treasury no longer looks at designations for those who are supporting terrorism. The Americans, some of the Muslims are afraid to give to charities because it might be a terroristic charity, and some of those charities are civilly liable. You said something. Are there no criminal sanctions in place, laws that says if you give to a terrorist organization contra U.S. laws that you are criminal, you can be charged with a crime?
No, sir. We do have an executive order. It's Executive Order 13224. This was the authority that I worked under at the Treasury when I was a terrorism finance analyst. And the distinction that I was drawing was that back when I was at Treasury and before, we had quite a track record of going after domestic entities that were involved in financing terrorism, so-called charities that were involved in that activity.
But that's criminal, is it not?
Well, it's actually under a different order. It's beyond criminal. I mean, it's considered, it's a terrorist act.
And let me just note for the record, the judge laid out a whole bunch of organizations that were pretty much anti-Israel, but he left out the UN. I just want to make that distinction. Let me move on. Dr. Witt, is that how you say that? You said that stabilize the frontline states that have peace treaties with Israel. Who are they, and rank them in order?
Rank them in importance?
Yes, ma'am.
The most important frontline state for Israel is Jordan. It is the bulwark for Israel against the Islamist radicalism of ISIS and other groups to the east. And for a long time, it was Israel's land bulwark against an army invasion. I think that the Jordanian-Israeli peace treaty and the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty are strong. They're maintained by both sides because they are in both sides.
I'm out of time technically, but who are the next ones? Just give me 3 or 4 of them.
Well, the only treaties that Israel has with its neighbors are with Jordan and Egypt.
All right, thank you very much.
Yep.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I thank all of you all for being here. Without objection, the map that was furnished to you and all the members of Congress be made a part of the record. Dr. Shanzer, you made some comments about you would give us information in a different setting that the good lady from Florida made a comment about. We will follow up on that because we want that information as well. And members of Congress may have written questions they will submit to you. We would expect them answered and returned to the chair. Thank you all for being here. Subcommittees are adjourned.